Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Oh, thank you. Very nice welcome. My name is Susan Madera, and I am the Academic Specialist for High Impact Practices at Queensborough Community College. I want to welcome you to this Common Read event, but I really want to welcome you to the Holocaust Resource Center and Archives. That's where we're meeting today. This is a wonderful resource for our faculty, staff, and students. We have many different displays. We have one permanent display that's in the front when you first come in. And if you haven't taken a look at it, I ask you to please take some time and look at it. There's also a display right now, and it's on cruel correspondence, anti-Semitic postcards. And it's right outside this room. I ask you to take a look at it on your way out later. It's really quite exceptional. We're here today as part of the Common Read of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. What a fabulous book.
Yes.
I'm sure, yes, I see a lot of yeses. Okay. At Queensborough, the Common Read was created so that we can help you to make connections across the disciplines. Well, what does that mean? That means that when you read this book, it's not just to read a book. We want you to make the connections to biology, especially that bio group in the back. Welcome. Sociology, psychology, history. There's so much in here. And by having these co-curricular events that are part of your classes, we're hoping to help you make these connections across the disciplines. So far, the response has been very positive. We're currently in the 9th event of 18 events that have been scheduled for 3 weeks. Some of you I've seen before several times, so welcome again. And others, I'm sure I will be seeing you again. Today's event is called Human Guinea Pigs, Involuntary Medical Experimentation, A Global Perspective. This is really an intense subject, so prepare yourselves. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Ms. Beth Lilac, who's the Senior Director of Education and Community Affairs at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center in Nassau. So let's welcome our guest.
It's really nice to be here. It's really a privilege. So thank you for inviting me, Susan. I love coming here to QCC. And please do come back to this Holocaust Center. Come and visit ours. We have also a museum, do a lot of programs. If anybody's interested in children, in different types of internships that may or may not be available here at QCC, please give me a call because we have all sorts of types of internships if you're interested. As Susan mentioned, this is a very heavy presentation today. And just to put it a little bit in context, I have been in the field of Holocaust and genocide history for over 23 years. I have done a lot of presentations. I have seen horrors that I hope you never see or hear about or read. Some of the research I did for this presentation, I had to just stop what I was doing for a while and go and take a break. Some of it is so horrific, but it's also so painful. So painful because when you hear what our own country has been doing and what has been doing to American citizens, there are some things that I absolutely stunned. And I just want to give you kind of a heads up that it doesn't, I'm not going to be ending on a very optimistic note because the result, what we know that is going on and what's continuing to go on is really hard to take. And so you as young people, as students, as people going into biology fields, medical fields, whatever field you're going into, hopefully you'll take some of this knowledge, this information, and hopefully you can make a dent into some of the policies, the regulations, the laws, and some of the abuses that are going on today. But it's a very hard subject to really absorb. I'd like to have this as interactive as possible. I'd like to have as much discussion as you would like to have. You have a lot more expertise in certain subjects than I do, so please bring that to the table. If I speak too fast or too slow, or you don't understand a word I'm using, let me know. If there's anything that you want to just interrupt me on and you have a question, please feel free. Okay? Okay, so some of what I'm going to be talking about are certain generalizations, but the majority of victims of involuntary medical experimentation, the majority, are people of color, indigent people, women, children, people with disabilities, indigenous people, and one group that has been experimented upon continuously are prisoners, all different types of prisoners. And a lot of it comes down to the worth, the social, the economic, the human worth that one group gives to another group. And we're going to get into this a little bit more. Oops. One of the terms used in medical experimentation is the term offshoring. Has anybody heard of this term before? You've heard of outsourcing? When we outsource jobs to other countries, this is exactly the same thing. Different companies are outsourcing or offshoring medical experimentation outside of the United States because they have a lot more freedom to do so. They can conduct different types of experiments that maybe would be either illegal or more difficult to do here. One of the statistics recently released is that somewhere between 40 and 65% of medical experiments that are funded by the United States government are done overseas. This number is really frightening. Less than 1% of American medical experiments, conducted by American companies, funded by our government, less than 1% that are conducted overseas in another country are reviewed and looked at in terms of if they're following proper regulations. Less than 1%. So already that tells you this field is just wide open for abuse. And this is a report that came out from the US Department of Health and Human Services. The red X's are the areas that we're going to be touching upon today. We're going to be going deeper into some of these countries and then just touching upon very briefly with some of the other ones. But I really did want to look at different parts of the world, as the title says, to really give you a global perspective. And these are the different countries that we will be looking at to different degrees. So, who is conducting these involuntary medical experiments? Well, governments. United States government conducts them, funds them. A lot of times when they're going into other countries, they have the cooperation and the knowledge of that host country. Sometimes they don't, but more often than not, they do. A lot of the involuntary medical experiments are conducted by our military, the US Army, Air Force, Navy, and I'll give you some examples of those later on. Who is conducting these? Who is actually out in the field, whether it's here in the United States or overseas? Medical profession, doctors, scientists, laboratory assistants, nurses. The main force behind, outside of the military, that's behind involuntary experimentation, are the pharmaceutical companies. I don't think that will come as any surprise to anybody, especially if you've read the book on Henrietta Lacks. And the reason being, oops, I don't know what I did over there. The reason being that this is such a massively profitable industry, especially when you're using free labor, free subjects, or very cheap. All of the pharmaceutical companies, all of their profits combined, I mean, we're talking like $1 trillion industry. This is huge, absolutely huge. One of the other reasons, I'm sorry, I don't know how to get rid of that thing, so just ignore it. One of the other reasons, I don't understand why all these inferior people think I'm ignorant, is this superiority complex that Americans have, that white people have, that men have, that different groups have, that the government has, the military has, where they will deem other people that I gave you that first list as less than equal, as unworthy of the same human rights as other people. The other reason that these experiments are conducted is because they are looking for cures to diseases. They are looking to, genuinely to improve the health of all of us. These are just some of the profits that are predicted for pharmaceutical companies by region. What do you notice about this map? What strikes you? If you can make out some of the percentages of the countries. This is the increase percentage-wise of profit. What do you notice? Anybody? You're in bio studies. You're in an immersion program. You guys are smart. What do you notice about this? Excuse me? Small group? Okay, well, one of the things that I notice, the highest percentages are where? South America, China, India. Lowest percentage in America. What does this tell you? Where are the biggest profits of experimentation in pharmaceutical companies? Overseas. All different reasons behind why people are abused and why their human rights are not respected. Whether, there's a lot of experiments such as the Tuskegee, such as what happened that you read about in the Henrietta Lacks book. Different experiments have been done on women, on poor people. There's all different reasons. The main reason, regardless of what some of these are, is that that person, those group of people, are not seen as having equal human rights. That these are somehow inferior, subhuman, as the people conducting these tests. Just very quickly, I'm going to ask some of you to also read. I know you don't want to just be listening to my voice all of this time. Those of you in the medical profession, can someone read just what happened in the 5th century BCE with Hippocrates? Oh, you are a tough group. Yes, please.
5th century BCE, primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Medical ethics standard attributed to Hippocrates. This oath became obligatory for physicians.
So way back, 5th century BCE, already that was one of the first foundations in the medical field. Do no harm. Unfortunately, that has been completely, not completely, but that for many times has been ignored and overlooked and discounted. Cleopatra is one of the earliest people that we know of that did involuntary medical experiments. She was really interested in the gestation process of fetuses. And so she made sure that her handmaidens, her female servants, were impregnated, and then their wombs were ripped open and cut open at different stages of pregnancy so she could see how the development was progressing. Maimonides from the 12th century, he was a rabbi, he was a physician, and the Maimonides oath, may I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain. And if only this was implemented and felt by today's physicians and people in the experimentation field. Oops, wrong one. I want you to take a look. I have slides with a lot of information on it, so I'd like you to read what I have up here. We'll talk about some of them, and pick out the ones that you find most impactful, that you find interesting. One of the earlier slides, this is a picture, supposedly, of one of the first gynecological exams from Dr. Sims in Alabama, and this is a slave woman named Lucy. And of course, this was against her will. She's a slave. He's considered the father of American gynecology. And what he did on her and other female slaves was absolutely horrific. And there's a lot of things that I'm not going to detail because this isn't, if you want to ask me certain questions afterwards, but really, in the name of science, quote, really horrific, sadistic types of experimentation. She didn't have any type of anesthesia. These women were never given any type of medical attention afterwards to hopefully try and prevent some infections. Even though it's very early on, they didn't always know what was causing things. But there was no real care for the patient because she was a piece of property. During this time, we do have people that are stepping forward and really protesting and opposing the human rights abuses. Never perform an experiment which might be harmful to the patient, even though highly advantageous to science or the health of others. And you'll see this over and over again through history, where people in the medical field are making these kind of statements. It's just, unfortunately, they don't have the power and the influence to compare to the army, to the government, to the pharmaceutical companies. Boston, the Children's Hospital in Boston is world famous. Absolutely world famous. Back in the late 1800s, they were doing procedures, tests on children, spinal tap tests, because this was a fairly new procedure. And other doctors around the country labeled them, as you can see, as human vivisections. Whenever there's a certain experiment that I'm highlighting that is focused on prisoners, I will highlight that in red, and you're going to see a lot of red throughout this. I just want to point out Dr. Sharp down in Indiana at the state prison. He was one of the early pioneers of sterilization research, and he used the prisoners at Indiana State Prison as his test subjects. Has anyone heard of Walter Reed? Who's Walter Reed? What is Walter Reed? Anybody? Are there any veterans in here or active duty soldiers? Walter Reed is a very famous medical hospital, Army Medical Hospital. It was named after an Army major, Dr. Walter Reed. And what a lot of people don't know is the history. Who was this man? What did he do? Well, he conducted involuntary, uninformed experimentation in Cuba on immigrants from Spain who were there to work. If these people survived, and he injected them with yellow fever, if they survived, he would give them $100. In 1900, something was enacted in Berlin, the Berlin Code of Ethics. Again, different countries around the world, different medical professionals are calling for better ethics and better human rights. So the Berlin Code of Ethics forbids any type of experimentation, as you can see, basically, if there's no informed consent. And they actually say unambiguous consent. They want to make sure that the subject really knows what is happening and all the consequences involved. I wanted to point out what was happening in the Philippines, because these are not, this physician here comes from Harvard Medical School. These are top institutions in the world that are conducting these experiments. And here he's injecting prisoners with cholera, trying to find a cure for cholera. Why do you think that there are so many experiments conducted in prisons? Yes?
Because they're looked down on by society for what they've done, so they feel like they can take away their rights to this experimentation.
Okay. What else? Why else? Yes, please.
Probably because they have a wide variety of people in the prisons.
Sometimes some prisons are filled with a particular group of people, a particular ethnicity. There's a disproportionate number of African Americans that are imprisoned in this country. But sometimes you would get different ages involved. Absolutely. Yes, please.
Well, the prisoners, obviously they don't have any rights, so they usually could take advantage and do whatever they want with them.
Right. We already know that there's so much abuse in the prison system, and doing something like this. Sometimes the prisoners were told, sometimes they could volunteer. Prisoners can't vote. They don't have a political force behind them. They don't have any economic force. Sometimes they were told what was going on. And they would be told, look, if you volunteer for the study, we'll shorten your sentence, or we'll give you extra cigarettes, or we'll pay you $50. Is that informed consent? Or is it something else? A bribe? I mean, is it really informed consent if the person is incarcerated? How much choice do they really have? They don't have choice. Anyone else want to point out any of these other cases that I have listed? Mississippi, San Quentin. Okay. This was an involuntary procedure, but it was so important, I still want to bring it to your attention. She knew what was going to happen to her, so she was informed, but absolutely protested it. And what it is that the woman on the right is named Emma Buck, and this is her daughter, Carrie. Emma Buck was considered feeble-minded, mentally ill, and she was in the Virginia colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded. Her daughter had absolutely, quote, normal intelligence. But because her mother was seen as mentally ill, she was also sent to this institution. In the institution, they sterilized these women because they didn't want them to reproduce. And she fought this. She wanted to have children. So she sued the institution. This is back in the 1920s. The strength and the fortitude that this woman had, being a resident of a, quote, mental institution, taking on this very prestigious Virginia colony for epileptics, this was just absolutely incredible. And the case went to the Supreme Court. Would someone like to read the decision that the judge made? Please.
It is better for all the world if instead of, oh, thank you. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. I find it absolutely stupefying that Oliver Wendell Holmes said that.
Right. Is anybody familiar with who Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes is and what his legacy supposedly is? Anybody familiar with him? Supreme Court Justice.
When did the women get the right to vote?
I think that was like 1919, 1920. Yeah, I mean, she had the right to vote. She just had no rights. So she was legally sterilized. She lost the case. And it's very interesting how he compares it, because he's comparing it to, well, if we can involuntarily vaccinate people, if the state has that right, then certainly we have the right to cut somebody's fallopian tubes, that we have the right to sterilize people. He's making that kind of a parallel, which also to me is quite frightening. Is anyone familiar? This is a very, very famous case in medical experimentation history, what happens in Puerto Rico. Anybody familiar with this? Early 1930s, funded by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Experimentation, for medical research, excuse me. Dr. Rhodes went to Puerto Rico, and again, because of this offshoring, because it's so much looser, there's, different types of people there that maybe they wouldn't have to worry about certain overseeing here in the United States. So this Dr. Rhodes, who is quite well known, and maybe at some point biology students will come across his name, he went to Puerto Rico, infected the people there with cancer. This guy was so racist. I mean, beyond even racism. He literally called for the annihilation, the murder of all Puerto Ricans. So he went there, conducted his tests. He ended up being appointed because of his great notoriety, because he was so prestigious and successful. He ended up creating the United States Army Biological Warfare Units. He established them in Maryland, in Utah, and in Panama. He was appointed to head the United States Atomic Energy Commission. These are the guys. Look at their background. I mean, I don't know about you, but this just sent chills down me. But it also explained some of the atomic testing that was done here in America and overseas. Conducted lots of radiation experiments on prisoners, soldiers, American soldiers. And then he was honored by the American Association for Cancer Research. This is a guy that infected people with cancer, called for the annihilation of an entire people, of all Puerto Ricans. Not only honored by the American Association for Cancer Research, but they named an award after him. So even to this day, people are getting an award in his name. Here's a photo from the Tuskegee experiments, which I'm assuming all of you know about, and it was mentioned in the book about Henrietta Lacks. If you don't know about it, this is one of the most well-known, because this was an experiment on very, very poor African-American men, mainly sharecroppers in Macon County in Alabama. And they had syphilis, and treatment was withheld from them, even though it could have saved their lives, it could have made their lives better. But because of the experiments that were being done, they withheld any type of medical treatment. And this didn't come known until many years later. Look at the time period. It started in the 30s, it didn't end until the 70s. That is a long time period of secret experimentation. There's been different films made on this. It's a very well-known case. Now, this is also one of the most infamous world cases. And this is something that happened right at the beginning of World War II, 1939. Started a little bit earlier because Japan invaded China before 1939. And when Japan invaded and occupied China, most of you probably have heard about, quote, the rape of Nanking, some of the atrocities that happened. How many of you have heard about Unit 731? One person? And how did you learn about it? Where did you learn about it?
It's on the history. They had mentioned the Union 761 is a group of Japanese people, like the scientists. They involved the North and East. They catch the civilians, they make an experiment like a biohazards or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And where did you learn about this, what happened? From your family, from school?
No, I read it on the internet.
Okay, so you taught yourself. Anybody else hear of this particular unit?
Unit 731 is an army of the Japanese in 1939 to 1945. The Japanese army take some Chinese to the unit 731 to research that push partner to the people to research. That's it.
Okay, thank you. What they did at 731, what they called Unit 731, which was located in Manchuria and was the headquarters for biological warfare by the Japanese Army, what they did rivals what I know happened during the Holocaust in the Nazi concentration camps. It's absolutely horrific, and yet most people don't know about it. Has anyone in here heard of the camp, the Nazi camp called Auschwitz? Has anybody not heard of it? Raise your hand. And, I'm just curious. Okay, a few people. Okay. Most people have heard about the Holocaust, some of the camps, the experiments. What happened here was the same thing. Very, very similar, and yet very few people know about it. In all, Japan had about 26 different army labs, some in Japan, mostly in China. At least, the numbers are really hard to really pinpoint, but at least 250,000 people were murdered. This unit, which was the headquarters, was established with the knowledge of Hirohito, with the emperor. The medical director was this General Shiro Ishii, and if I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize, medical doctor. He had, as you can see, it was a massive complex, 3,000 employees. They had their own railroad station, their own airport. 10,000 people are estimated to have been murdered just at this one site. Most of the victims were Chinese. As you can see, there were also others, Mongolians, Koreans, Soviet and British prisoners of war. But for the most part, Chinese. A lot of children, women and men, elderly people. Like in genocides, or like when there's a major human rights abuse, mass murder, genocide, the perpetrating group does not see, of course, their victims as human beings. The Nazis saw Jews as vermin, as cancer, as subhuman, as non-human. The Hutus during the Rwandan genocide, which is portrayed somewhere here in this room, called the Tutsis, the group that they were murdering, cockroaches and snakes. Here, they referred to the Chinese people, the victims, as logs, like tree logs, and that's how they were referred to. And what they would do, as this gentleman said, is that they would drive around in these black vans, and because they were black, the townspeople, the community people, referred to them as ravens. And they would go around and just kidnap people, just take people out of their homes and their villages. As the trucks are driving through, other people can hear screaming from inside of the truck, people screaming for help. Sometimes they may have had an idea where they were going, sometimes they didn't. They just knew that they had been kidnapped and imprisoned and taken somewhere. Sometimes the prisoners were fed very, very well before they were tortured, before they were experimented upon, to, quote, fatten them up for better results, so they would have more physical substance. This picture, this is one of the saws that they would use on some of their victims. The next slide is a list of some of the things they did. It's really horrific. I just want to prepare you. Very horrific, like a handsaw. They never used anesthesia. They did these things when people were alive and awake, and it's extremely gruesome. So if you don't want to look at the list or listen to me, close your eyes. These are some of the types of experiments that they did. And I'll give you a second just to kind of absorb some of this. Like the Nazis, one of the reasons why there's a Holocaust Center here. There's a Holocaust Center where I work in Glen Cove. There's a huge museum in Washington, D.C., in Israel, around the world. One of the reasons is because there is so much evidence from the victims, from survivors, and we actually have one with us today if you want to ask her any questions afterwards. We have a Holocaust survivor and her daughter here. There's so much evidence, criminal evidence, testimony from survivors, from victims, and from the people doing these horrific things. The Nazis recorded everything, just as the Japanese army did. The Nazis took photos of all of the horrors that they committed, their experiments, their mass murders, genocide, the murder of babies, all sorts of horrific things. So did the Japanese army. Why do these people photograph and record these atrocities? Why do you think? Sorry? Trophies. And maybe, yes? For historical record, absolutely. For them, because they're carrying on their history, yes? Right, what they were doing, what the Japanese army was doing on human beings, which they didn't see as human beings, they just saw as logs, was to help the Japanese army, the elite Japanese. This was to further medical research. They don't see anything wrong with this, these kind of pictures, and then pictures I won't show you. They don't see anything wrong with that because they don't see that person as a person. This is the doctor. This is a picture of Dr. Ishii doing a live autopsy. And I specifically tried to find a picture that was kind of blurry. I didn't want to show you any details, but it gives you, shows you well enough. One of the doctors at Unit 31, I inserted the scalpel directly into the log's neck and opened the chest. At first, there was a terrible scream, but the voice soon fell silent. They know that they're working on human beings. One of the staff people, and this is very interesting because this is just identical to what was happening at the same time period over in Poland, in Germany, under Nazism. From the start, we were taught not to see, not to inquire, not to speak. And when he was asked, why did he do something so horrific, in this case, cutting the eyes out of victims, he said, I received an order. I was just following orders. Totally devoid of responsibility, compassion, humanity. I was just following orders. As if somehow that justifies the horrors that he committed. Before we move on, anybody want to say anything about this? Any questions? Yes, please.
When this kind of scientist do the terrific scientists do this kind of thing, do they really think if one day they will have the same as destiny around them?
That one day they'll realize how horrible it was? Is that what you, I'm sorry, is that what you asked?
I mean, do they really think if one day they will encounter as same as destiny around their life, so they will face the same thing? Other people just do this to them.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry.
Tell me if I'm right, he thinks that the doctors who are performing these things, would they ever stop to think that someday someone could do this to them?
Oh, okay. That's a great question. That's a great question. I don't know. I'm just theorizing. I would say no, because he sees himself, this doctor, as an elite person. And these Chinese people or Mongolians or whoever he's committing these atrocities on are not of his level, are not as human as he is, or are not human at all. So he always feels like he's going to be privileged. And you know what? I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but he's right. Because later on, all of the secret horrors, and whenever I use the term experimentation today, know that I have quotation marks around it. Because my opinion, my perspective is that if you are torturing somebody, if it's involuntary, if it's uninformed, these are not experiments. I would call this sadism. I would call it torture. I would call it human rights abuses. So know that I'm always couching it in quotation marks. But he was very secure in what he was doing, and he was right. Years later, when this came to light, when people found out what had happened, the United States stepped in and made a deal with Japan and with this doctor, saying, you turn over all of your research, we'll make sure that you never get tried for war crimes. And so he was given total immunity. Similar thing happened in the Holocaust. I mean, there were so many doctors and nurses and other medical personnel, midwives involved in crimes against Jews and others. About 22 of them were brought to trial. Not even all of them received sentences, very, very few. So most of the people doing these horrific things get away with it scot-free. You saw Dr. Rhodes, what he was doing, calling for the annihilation, calling for genocide against Puerto Ricans. He gets appointed to head up the Atomic Energy Commission. And the Cancer Foundation is naming an award after him. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me. I mean, it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer. Moving forward, because this was happening, that started back in like 39, even though it went to the end of the war. Same time period, but across the lake, across the ocean in Germany. There's a doctor called Eugene Fischer. And this guy headed up the medical institute and the scientific institute in Nazi Germany that taught all Nazi doctors. He was a eugenicist. There was, after World War I, Germany lost World War I. So part of their agreement for the treaty was that France sent in troops, army troops, to kind of settle in the border between France and Germany. France sent in their colonial troops. Their troops from Northern Africa, Morocco, Algiers, black colonial troops. These guys, like this one, was stationed in the Rhineland area, which borders France and Germany. They're there for many years. It's not a war going on. It's a peacekeeping operation. They meet local people. They fall in love with the women. They have children. These soldiers getting together with local German women, there were approximately 500 children of these mixed marriages. Dr. Fisher was really disgusted with the idea of mixed marriages or African or black blood mixed with German blood, because the Nazism wanted pure Aryan race, pure German race. So this is one of the girls of these mixed marriages. So in 1937, he had all 500 children sterilized. Some of them were very, very young, 3, 4, 5 years old. Others were in their 20s. Some of them died because of the surgeries, the operations. In a little while, when we start talking about Auschwitz and what happened with the doctor named Dr. Mengele, this is the guy that sent him to Auschwitz. He was the head of the institute that helped send Mengele to Auschwitz and conduct those horrific experiments. To highlight some of the things that our Army did, which is something that as an American citizen, I absolutely don't want to believe. The Army, not only on soldiers, which I don't really get into in this presentation because that is such a big subject, but on prisoners. Would go to different prisons and, you know, it was just an open subject field. This one particular one at Stateville Penitentiary in Chicago, which was co-sponsored by the US Army, they infected 400 prisoners with malaria, 1940s. This is during World War II. And they said this is to help American soldiers fighting in, you know, malaria-ridden countries, Philippines, etc. During the Nazi doctor's trial after the war, in the late 1940s, the Nazis' doctors, in their defense, said, look, Chicago, Americans were doing this. We were doing just the same thing. We did exactly the same thing. The experiments that we were doing at Auschwitz and at the other camps, we were doing it to help the German war effort. So why are you prosecuting us? You did the same thing on your own people. And they're right. Just to show you that no age was really safe, even experiments on babies. And of course, people with mental disabilities were also a prime subject area. They had absolutely no rights, very little voice. Most of them, even if it was explained to them or they read what was going to be done to them, depending on their intellectual ability, had no idea what was happening. So it really wasn't informed consent. And these people were locked in freezers for 120 hours. 120 hours just to see what cold would do to people with mental disabilities. Some of the most infamous experiments that have happened in our history were during the Holocaust, conducted by Nazi doctors. This is one such experimental room. In all, they did about 180 different types of experiments in different camps. The low number is 7,000 people were experimented upon, mainly Jews, but also Roma. Roma is the appropriate name for gypsies. And then you can also see babies, twins, women, and dwarfs. And the people conducting these experiments, you know, quote, were doctors, extremely educated, experienced doctors from very prestigious German and Austrian universities, just like the doctors from Harvard, from the Rockefeller Institute, etc. The Nazi medical experiments you can kind of set into two different types of groups, one for the military and one just to further their political ideology, their superiority ideology, Aryanism, that only tall, blonde, blue-eyed people had a right to live if you were of Nordic race. And so it was very different, the types of experiments that they committed. And you can see, and these are very, all of these experiments that they were doing for their military, we also did, for the same reasons. The eugenics was also happening in this country also. Sterilization, castration, etc. Sometimes in a different form. That's one of the needles that they used. Dachau was one of the camps where they did a lot of the military experiments. High pressure experiments, ice water, so if their pilots got shot down, how long could they stay alive, etc. And here again, just like with the Japanese Army, they're taking pictures of conducting, in the process of conducting these experiments which end up killing people. Ravensbrück was a camp in northern Germany, mainly for women. And so most of the prisoners there and most of the people experimented upon were women, and like other people, like the Chinese were referred to as logs, these women were referred to as rabbits. This is a group of women that survived the experiments. I hope I didn't do that. I don't know what happened. These women actually in 1943 protested what was being done to them, which is very, very rare. And they knew that any type of protest would get them executed. And most of them were killed, if not physically beaten up and tortured, etc. But some of them did survive. Another camp famous or infamous for the experiments was Buchenwald. And just one example, this is just some of the things that they did there. Auschwitz, which is located in Poland. All those other camps were in Germany. This one's in Poland. This was the largest Nazi concentration camp. They had a lot of different industries there, as well as blocks for experimentation. When people would arrive, they would be divided. First of all, you had women on one side, you can see on the left, and men on the right. And then there were doctors here, physicians. And the physicians would say, you go this way or you go that way. Hi. Being sent one way meant that you were immediately sent to the gas chamber. Being sent another way meant that you were selected to be a slave. Maybe you would live 3 months, maybe 6 months if you were lucky. Some, however, why would they have physicians doing the selection, do you think? Yes, please. Exactly. There were certain people that they wanted to use as human subjects. And those would get sent to a special place. There's some seats in the second row. We're talking about the Holocaust, the experiments that were going on during World War II at one particular camp called Auschwitz, for those of you just walking in. There were about 30 doctors doing these horrific things at Auschwitz. One of them is more well-known than the others, Dr. Mengele, but there were at least 30. One of them is Dr. Karl Klauberg, and he's the short little guy over there on the left. And he loved doing experiments on Jewish and Roma, Gypsy women, really horrific, sick gynecological experiments, sterilization experiments. When the war was over, he's trying to escape, but the Russian army caught him. They brought him to trial, and in 1948, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And then you can see, less than 10 years later, he didn't even serve a 10-year sentence, he's released. So earlier, that question about do they ever think it's going to happen to them, you know, there's just this history, this pattern of people doing these horrific crimes, and they don't have any consequences for it. This is the most famous doctor from the Holocaust that did experiments. There's a few seats up here in the second row if you guys want, if you don't want to stand. He was the head physician at the Auschwitz complex, so he was in charge of all the experiments. He was a captain, and he was a captain of the SS. Does anyone know what those letters stand for, what it means? What the SS means? Do you all know when I refer to the Nazis, do you know what I'm referring to? Does anybody not? Raise your hand and I'll be happy to say. You know, under Hitler and these elite group, the SS were the most elite. They wore black uniforms with a skull and crossbones on their hats, on their caps, on their uniforms. They were the most elite. They ran all of the concentration camps. They were in charge of all the racial ideology, all the eugenics, the mass murder. So he was a captain, he was an officer within this. And one of the things that he really enjoyed doing, and don't forget that guy who sterilized those 500 biracial children, sent him to Auschwitz, he was there to prove that he was doing the ideological experiments, to prove that the Nazis were superior, the Aryans were superior to everybody else. So he did horrific things on little babies and twins and dwarfs, Jews, and Roma. This is a picture of him. This right here is a retreat area near the camp because, of course, they need to have vacation days. They have such difficult days at work. So here's a guy playing an accordion. This is Mengele. And they would go on these retreats after they would either do mass gassings of people or experiments and go and enjoy themselves and have fun. One of the things, you know, with the Aryan ideology, the perfect Aryan, the perfect German was tall, muscular, blonde, and blue-eyed. Well, I can tell you that in Nazi Germany during this time period in the 40s, it was almost impossible to find blonde hair dye in the stores because everybody was dyeing their hair blonde. And they would dye their children's hair blonde, their grandparents. Everybody wanted to look like the perfect Aryan if they were German. The other thing that they wished they had had was blue eyes. And this is before contact lenses. Otherwise, there would have been, you know, the stock for blue contact lenses would have been off the charts. So one of the things that Mengele did was to inject dye into people's eyes to try and turn them blue. And he would have all different shades of blue and a whole spectrum of trying to get certain colors. These are some of the types of experiments that he would conduct on people. And again, quotation marks around experiments. When you don't use anesthesia, when you're killing somebody, you know, these are not experiments as we know them to be. These are twins that were actually with their mother in another camp, a ghetto, called Terezin in Czechoslovakia. In 1942, that's when this picture was taken. This was right before they were sent to Auschwitz. And these two little kids, these things that we're just talking about now, those horrific things, they were done on these kids. So I want you to put faces. I want you to know that these were human beings we're talking about when we're talking about these subjects, when you see the word log or other things. Would someone like to read what Irene, this little girl, later said about what she went through? Somebody in the front row who can see it easily, please.
I remember going to Mengele. I have recollections of blood being taken from my neck and my arms. I hate doctors. The blood from my neck was very painful, but I knew I couldn't cry, and I didn't. I never cried.
And her brother,
and her brother Renee says, when I got to the infirmary, I always had to get undressed. I was put between two cold plates of an x-ray machine.
very few of these children survived. Very few. Up until recently, the Holocaust archives in Israel and the Washington, D.C. Museum, we've known about this photo. These are two sets of twins. They're Roma, they're gypsies. And this is a photo that I put in our own museum in Glen Cove, except out of respect for these children, I did not show the lower half. I'm showing it to you because we're all adults and this is the type of presentation it is. But the caption for these two sets of twins is that these were two sets of Roma, of gypsy twins that were experimented upon by Mengele and were lucky enough to survive. And these are two sets of girls. Well, what we now know, because there's always new research coming out about the Holocaust, is that these are not girls. These are boys. And they were castrated by Mengele as children. His other specialty, his other love, was to experiment on dwarfs. And this is a family. You can see they're wearing the Jewish stars on their clothes. They're being brought into Auschwitz. This is a family of dwarfs. They were a very large family of dwarfs. They were very artistic. They had a musical troupe called the Lilliput Troupe. And they had an orchestra, and they would go and, they were musicians. They were all brought to Auschwitz. Mengele absolutely loved experimenting upon them. By some miracle, they all survived. Eventually, they went to Israel, continued to work and perform as musicians, and then you can see later on in '55 they retired. Would someone like to read this quote? Please. Thank you.
Dr. Mengele and his people experimented on me because I was a dwarf. It was agonizingly painful. Because of my artistic talent, I was ordered by Mengele himself to draw the twins and other dwarfs. Mengele also loved to have his portraits drawn by me regularly.
Thank you. And this was Ludovic Feld. Ludovic Feld was from Czechoslovakia. He was an artist before the Nazi time. Nazis took him, he went to Auschwitz, and as you can see, Mengele experimented upon him. This is one of the drawings he made of the twins in the barracks. Because he was so little as a dwarf, physically little, he was put in with the boys, with little boys. And that's why you can see him bunking, and there was many little children per wooden bunk. As the end of the war approached, there was a call for a death march. The guards wanted to take all the Jews still surviving in the camp and march them into Germany, maybe to ransom them off maybe to get a better surrender deal with the Americans or to use them as slave labor, all different reasons. But Ludovic said, there's something not right here. And 15 of the boys in his barracks, he said, you're not going. I don't trust the guards. Something bad is going to happen. You stay here. I'm going to hide you and protect you, and you're going to be safe. And they trusted him. He was an adult, even though maybe physically he was the same size as them. They referred to him as Uncle Ludovic, Uncle Lajos. And he ended up rescuing their lives. He hid them under floorboards for about 2 weeks and fed them and kept them safe. And the end of January, the Russians came in and liberated the camp. This is a scene that the Soviets captured. Obviously, it's a little bit after liberation, and the children are coming out. All of these children that you see were experimented upon by Mengele. These are all surviving twins. This is Ludovic Feld right here with the glasses. He eventually went back to Czechoslovakia and continued being an artist. This is one of his other artworks from '48. This is a rendition of one of the boys after they had had some type of experimental brain surgery. And these are the gas chambers and crematorium in the background. And this is him as an adult. And he just passed away in '91. My life reminds me of a small seed trapped beneath a boulder, weak and twisted, yet struggles toward the sun, grows and bears fruit. He continued to be an artist and felt that that was his, that was what helped him to survive mentally after the Holocaust. Has anyone heard of Project Paperclip? Project Paperclip? Project Paperclip, 1945, the end of the war. The Americans, there's this myth that America, and I'll speak just about America right now because we live in America, and was one of the primary countries involved in the war and after the war. America knew what was happening during the Holocaust. At all times, they knew. The myth of the government not knowing is just simply not true. So they knew what was happening with the Nazis trying to build atomic weaponry, and they knew about the experiments, they knew the gas chambers, they knew what was happening. So at the end of the war, before the actual surrender, before the actual end, what they did is go in and recruit all of these Nazis, Nazi scientists, Nazi doctors. They brought them to America, gave them really nice lives, anything they wanted, with the condition that they worked on our atomic program, our space program. It was Nazi scientists who helped launch the Apollos, and also the germ and biological warfare, because they had done so many gassings. They were experts in gas and other chemicals, and also experimentation. So we imported this group of Nazis to the United States to work in our military and our medical profession. And it was referred to as, it was a secret operation referred to as Project Paperclip. And this is what I mentioned before. In 1946 is when US and Japan, they transferred the Unit 731, all that data, to America and gave them immunity. What has our government done? I mean, I don't, I can theorize, but just to put the question out there, what has our government done with all of this data and information and research from the Japanese army, from the Nazis, what they did in Puerto Rico? What is all of this being used for? Something to think about. What have they done with this research? Even experimenting on veterans in Veterans Administration hospitals. They even had, a file was found where in 1946 they were even saying, this is an order, it's top secret, classified, but when you are experimenting upon veterans in the VA hospitals, do not use the word experiment, because that's a loaded term, that's a red flag for people. We don't want anyone to think we're experimenting on our own soldiers, on our own veterans. Use the terms investigations or observations. Guatemala is also another very infamous case. Has anyone heard about the Guatemalan research back in the 1940s? These were against Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners in their state penitentiary, a lot of people with disabilities, and women, a lot of women. They infected them with different types of venereal diseases, and what they did, and you can see this quote right here, which is really something else, and if you ever wonder where your taxpayer money might be going today, and for taxpayers during the 1940s, where it went, they were purchasing women to go into the prisons in Guatemala, infect the prisoners so that they could do experiments on the women and on the men. And if the women didn't have any VD, then they gave it to them. And they did it really horrifically and painfully, as you can see, and very sadistically. The medical team in Guatemala, and one of the reasons I bring it up to you, the medical team in Guatemala that they were doing this on with syphilis, gonorrhea, look at right here. It was led by Dr. Cutler. Dr. Cutler was one of the physicians in the Tuskegee experiments. That is not a coincidence. That is absolutely not a coincidence. He was successful in Tuskegee, and so of course they're using him here also. And this is during the same time period as Tuskegee experiments are still going on. Those didn't end until 72, don't forget. With Guatemala, and I have a slide on it later, but in Guatemala, Guatemalans recently have brought suit and have tried to sue to get some type of recognition and reparation for what was done to them. And you'll see what's very interesting about how that was handled by our government. These are just different types of different experiments. You can see one that I want to point out that is maybe because I lived near San Francisco, so this one affected me more than some of the other ones. From the 1950 to 1969, San Francisco, and this wasn't limited to San Francisco, it ended up happening coast to coast. The Navy, in trying some of their biological warfare to see if the Navy put a ship off the coast of a country and wanted to infect a population, the enemy, how much toxins did they have to use? How far away would a ship have to be from the coast? How big an area could they cover? So they needed to experiment. So where did they experiment? In San Francisco Bay. In San Francisco Bay on residents living in San Francisco. And these were called mock biological warfare attacks. Has anyone been to San Francisco? It's a beautiful city. Okay, now, if that, one of the prisons that, unfortunately, the prisoners of there for so many decades, you can see 52 to 80, so many decades of abuse of prisoners was in Holmesburg prison. And here's just one photo from one of the experiments. And he is a medical administrator. 33 drug companies tested 153 drugs on the prisoners there. And one of the other things to keep in mind throughout all of these different case studies that I've been giving you is that if the people survived from what was done to them, if they survived, they were left scarred many times. They were left in pain. They had physical disabilities. They might have incurred other diseases later on in life, other cancers, maybe multiple sclerosis, different types of diseases. And in many cases, they then passed it on to their children, which is something that hasn't fully been studied yet because of what they were infected with. Anyone live in Staten Island? Go to Staten Island? Anyone familiar with the Willowbrook State School? Right here, Staten Island, our next door neighbor. There was a school there for people with mental disabilities. And they did horrific experiments there. And this was a state-funded school. These kids, and this is a photo of children at the school. This is how they were treated, and this is one of the better pictures. They were basically just left on their own, but there was a lot of other abuses that were going on. They were forced to drink milkshakes that had hepatitis in them. Now, their parents knew what was happening to them because the only way these kids could be put into this school is if the parents or the guardians gave permission. The parents were told, if you don't allow your child to participate in these studies, they will not be accepted into the school. And the doctor here who supervised, Dr. Saul Krugman, really believed that he was serving mankind, helping to find a cure for hepatitis at the cost of the lives, the mental and physical well-being of these children. All right, if nothing else got to you, then this one should. I just want you to take a look at what happened in the 60s. The same thing that happened in San Francisco, which they did in many other places in the country, if not with naval ships, then they did it Then they release toxins, maybe flying over and dropping it from the sky. They release toxins in the New York subway system. What are you thinking about? I mean, you're a very quiet group. I know I am throwing an enormous amount of really difficult, horrible, painful information at you. I do understand that. But I'd really like to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling at this point. Any thoughts, any comments? Yes, please.
I feel betrayed.
Absolutely. Anyone just want to vent? Anyone want to say anything? I mean, it's really, you know, it's easy to disassociate or to separate yourself when you're hearing about these things happening to other people, even the Tuskegee experiments, Guatemala, Puerto Rico, the Holocaust. You know, it doesn't touch you. But when you see that it's happening in the New York subway system, because we live here, and I'm sure that most of you have been on the subway system, I have, you know, it'll affect you a different way. So I just want to give you the space to get anything off your mind that you want to. Yes, please.
I feel their pain. Like, I actually do feel their pain. It hurts.
Yeah, it does. Even though these were secret experiments, and what happened in San Francisco, some of the files, some have been declassified over the years, some haven't been. But doctors in the area, like in the San Francisco Bay Area, the New York area, after a certain amount of time, all of a sudden, doctors were seeing a massive increase in patients exhibiting the same symptoms. Some immediately because of the toxins, others over a certain amount of time. Things that people just normally didn't experience, especially not in mass numbers. So that started to really alert the medical community. Because this wasn't, you know, it's not like they called up local doctors and said, by the way, on Tuesday, we're going to be spraying the subway system, so expect an increase at the hospitals and in your, you know, your practice. Oh, just also want to point out the Helsinki Declaration. We've heard, you know, the Berlin, we've heard over the decades, different people are coming forward saying, no, you must have informed consent, you can't be doing this on human beings, etc. Again, with Helsinki, very famous, you know, people come first, individual rights come first. This was in '64. Obviously, it doesn't mean anything to the CIA and the Army. Mexican American women were uninformed, purposefully uninformed about tests that were being done at different birth control centers that they were going to. In San Antonio, Texas, they believed they were getting birth control pills when in fact they were just placebos. So here they are going thinking they're going to get something to prevent pregnancy, and it doesn't happen. They were used as guinea pigs for pharmaceutical companies. And there was massive protest by the women once this came to, once they realized what was happening. Even though the Tuskegee experiments began decades earlier, a final report was finally released in the 70s. And again, National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. You know, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of money spent on these reports, on these commissions, but in reality, the practice hasn't changed. And the there's certain groups that have really been targeted. You know, I gave that list, you know, prisoners we've seen over and over again. But poor women and women of color, these were some of the protests in San Antonio from the women that were, I'm sorry, there were also some sterilization experiments that went on there. This is in protest, making the point, just like up here, that involuntary medical research, especially forced sterilization on a group of people, like poor women, like black women, like Mexican American women, this is in direct violation to the United Nations Genocide Convention, which states it's a crime against humanity if you take measures intended to prevent the births within a specific group. That is part of the Genocide Convention in direct violation. These are some more examples and what was done on some poor women receiving Medicaid, Native Americans. Over the years, so many involuntary sterilizations, so many birth control types of experiments. And these were performed when you think, how could somebody be sterilized without knowing it? They would go in for regular medical checkup or gynecological checkup or some other type of surgery, and this would be done to them without their even knowing it. Puerto Rican women, not only were they being sterilized en masse in Puerto Rico, but also in the United States. And you can see some of the statistics, which is so far magnified by white women in the United States. FDA prohibits prisoner use for medical experiments. Short and simple and sweet, clear as a bell, 1980. Obviously, it still doesn't stop that from happening. Supreme Court, when a soldier sued the Army because they were tested with LSD without their consent, without their knowledge, the Supreme Court said you cannot sue the Army for that. The Army is exempt. All military is exempt, the government's exempt, CIA is exempt. Certain groups are exempt, and these are the same groups that are sponsoring it. And here, the Nuremberg Code, which came out after the Holocaust, that basically is saying the same thing, was waived for the Department of Defense. So the question is about justice, and if it's even possible. Basically, this is talking about how it is absolutely horrific to use people in psychiatric institutions for experimentation. And this particular justice is comparing it to what the Nazis did. I wanted to put this up because this reminded me of Henrietta Lacks and the cells and all the different pictures of her cells. They were really quite beautiful. These are brain scans of children that were taken during our research right here in New York with Columbia University, Queens, Mount Sinai School of Medicine on very, very young kids, Black and Hispanic boys between the ages of 6 to 10, and what they did to these kids. And look at the year. This is just yesterday, 1996. This is not 1930, 1920, 1940, 1996. Right here in New York City by Columbia, Mount Sinai. They injected the kids with certain chemicals because they wanted to prove that these kids would grow up to be criminals. And they could tell that by looking at their brain scans and how the chemicals reacted with their brains. Finally, in '97, there's an official recognition and apology by the President of the United States, and this is one of the survivors of the Tuskegee experiments. Across the country in Nigeria, Pfizer, a huge pharmaceutical company, pays the Nigerian government $75 million, not because they did anything wrong with experiments there, but just because they want to help out the Nigerian government. This is one of the boys who was injected with meningitis and had brain damage for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life. Different reports and commissions have come out. This is specifically about Guatemala. And again, official recognition and apology to Guatemalan's president. And, politically, I'm a supporter of Hillary Clinton. And yet, I want to say to her, why are you apologizing to the president today? You need to look up if there's any victims or there's families from those experiments and apologize to them and compensate them somehow. For the sake of time, if we have more time and if you're interested, I have a very short clip. It's about 3 minutes on Guatemala and the experiments down there. But let me just get to the end. 2012, literally yesterday, literally, U.S. District Judge officially, legally admits that those experiments were absolutely horrific, what they did to Guatemala. But the Guatemalan study is troubling, blah, blah, blah. This court is powerless to provide any redress to the plaintiffs. The Guatemalans sued the government. Their pleas are more appropriately directed to the political branches of our government, who, if they choose, have the ability to grant some type of relief of those affected in the Guatemalan study. What does that say to you? I mean, how do you interpret that? How do you feel about that? This just happened, 2012. They're saying we can't do anything about it. Maybe our government will. It's a political issue. It's not human rights. It's not medical. It has nothing to do with all the different commission and reports you saw up on the slides, the different Helsinki, the Nuremberg Code. They're just throwing all of that away and saying, we can't deal with this for political reasons. It's just mind-boggling. And it got a lot of coverage. I don't know how much, if you notice, I mean, CNN was covering it. Times was covering it. In the past decades, the United States has passed over 1,000 different types of regulations. I've only shown you a few of them, just a few. But there's so many problems with that. One is that who's enforcing them? Nobody. Who's even reviewing them? Nobody. Who's exempt? Almost everybody. So this is going on, and I warned you at the very beginning, this is not going to end well, this presentation. It's depressing, it's scary. Nothing has been done. We are, we don't know. You're going to a New York library to do some research. How do you know that that day they're not releasing toxins into the subway system? How do you know that? You don't know. And you have no legal rights. And it might affect your children, your future. And so the question is, what's happening today? What's going to happen tomorrow? One of the new targets has to do with the Genome Project and genome research and DNA. And if any of the biologists want to jump in, they're really targeting indigenous women, women who come from matrilineal societies where the family, the ancestry is traced through the mother, because it's a much clearer, direct line than when you go patrilineal with the father, because then it can branch off all different ways. But with the mother, it's a more direct line. So these women, indigenous women, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, etc., they are being targeted for DNA genome research because because some of that research is looking back into the most ancient, the oldest of human beings. And so this is how they're going to trace it. So it's probably going on right now, probably will go on tomorrow. I don't know if anyone in this room is aware of this or if you want to comment on it. And I think, oops, my last slide. Theodore Roosevelt, of all people, I just love this quote. To educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. And it's true. And I thank you so much for your attention. And I know I have completely overloaded and overwhelmed you. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. And I think I'm okay time-wise. I didn't go over my time. Anybody want to add anything in? Anything with the DNA or genome? About anything else? Anything you want to get off your chest? Yes, please.
I'd just like to say that mapping someone's genome is not like, it doesn't harm anyone.
No, yes, from what I know, and I am totally ignorant about that, it doesn't harm, but it gets into the same questions as like with Henrietta Lacks. Are people being informed what kind of profits are going to be made? Yes, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that there was any torture or sadism involved in that whatsoever. Thank you for making me clear on that. But it gets into, are the people, are they going to be informed, and will they really have the will to consent to what's being done? And at the end of Henrietta Lack's book, what was scary news to me is that basically scientists, doctors can do anything they want with us if we go to see them. Once I go and donate blood or have a biopsy or have anything taken out of my body and I willingly let them test it, it's no longer my property. So, yes, please.
Should we just forgive them? Because after this presentation, I feel so angry.
And, yeah, and you know, I'm sorry. I mean, I feel angry too, and I don't. One of the things that I was hoping is to have a good discussion about what's come up, because I don't, you know, there's no one strong solution for this, because it's so large and beyond us. Not that we can't do anything. We're never helpless. We're never helpless once we have the knowledge to a certain degree. You know, it's hard. I mean, this is not, and I said, you know, of all the presentations I've given, and I've given a lot on Holocaust and genocide, this one is really difficult because this is affecting us now, and it's overwhelming. Yes, please.
Question about Plum Island. Isn't it Plum Island, a little island off of Long Island on the North Shore?
Yeah.
Right, which is like a secret government-only island, and all sorts of experiments and things are going on there. And I wondered if you...
I don't know the details of what's going on there. I've heard similar things. That wasn't something that I, you know, did research in for this presentation. There's a lot of other big cases out there that are not included in here. And there's a lot you saw that I just had to skip over just for the sake of time. Unfortunately, when you're doing research on involuntary medical experimentation, you are subjected to thousands and thousands and thousands of cases. It's mind-boggling. And I'm sorry, I don't have any. If anyone in here knows what's going on in Plum Island? I don't.
I guess it's something for us to research.
It's something for us to research because it's right
out there.
I live on Long, you know, well, we're sort of all technically on Long Island, but I'm even closer being in Nassau. God knows what's going on there. Wasn't that where the Montauk Monster was supposed to come from?
Yeah.
But something like this, from what I've learned, it really makes me think, you know, from what I remember hearing about AIDS and how it developed as a virus and as a disease was so abnormal for anything else. You know, so it's just so easy to understand that it could have been very easily some type of form of biological warfare gone bad or whatever. You know, it's just what's the next disease going to hit us? What are we going to be hit with tomorrow?
Beth, is there anything that we can do now that you've empowered us and given us all this education? Is there anything that we can do? Does letter writing help?
You know, definitely. There's some really good articles. If there's anyone is interested, I'll be happy to send you different articles, different resources. Obviously, you're all smart. You know how to use the web. There's a lot of great stuff on the web. But the best thing that we can do, whether it's protesting genocide, whether it's protesting what you just saw here, is to make your voice heard to our elected officials. Make your voice heard to the pharmaceutical companies. If enough people do it, something will change. But if people don't take notice, if we don't insist on our courts finding different results, if we don't put pressure on the president, on Congress to change the laws or to enforce the laws, enforce the regulations, then nothing will change. So that's probably one of the strongest things that we can do. And it's also because you're younger and smarter, help us in the future. How do we avoid some of this?
And I just want to ask you about your feelings of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. How did you enjoy the text? How did it help you to make the connections to create this presentation?
I thought it was a really powerful book. It was really eye-opening. I did not know about her and felt really stupid that I had never heard about her, where I'm sure I've benefited because I've had the polio vaccine and I've had different vaccines, so I've benefited from the cells of this woman. But it really does bring into question what we are owners of, or how do we even control our own body parts, when they are sold and the profits that are made. I mean, we can't really, the medical research is one thing, but the profits that are made from using our cells, and I think something with the royalties for that family, to think that trillions of dollars have been made and her family can't even afford health care. There's great policy discussion right there.
Yeah, if you guys want to hear the political people to listen to you, there's actually a lobby day coming up, which is you can actually go to Albany and talk to some of the senators and the state legislators. So, if you guys are interested, you can talk to student government and they can.
That's a great suggestion. There's also something now online, I think it's called We the People, where it's like an online petition. If you can gather 25,000 signatures, which really isn't that hard with sending it out, social media-wise, if you can gather 25,000 signatures, the President of the United States, President Obama, has to address the issue, has to read this petition and has to officially, formally address it. So you can Google that and you can start a campaign. You send it to your friends, they send it to friends, and you can easily get 25,000 signatures.
I'd like to ask a question of one of the professors who's in attendance. Dr. Novick, could you comment on the presentation that you just witnessed today?
I had heard of some of the stories that you spoke of, but it's shocking how many there really have been throughout history. Between genocide and experimentation, it's really horrifying. As far as experimentation, and speaking of Henrietta specifically, we talked to, we discussed several times in my course, do the ends justify the means? Right. And consent. And everybody seemed to agree that you kind of get to know Henrietta a little bit in the book. And if she had just been told, she probably would have done it. She probably would have
Agreed.
Given anything to hopefully, find all these cures that they had with polio and hepatitis and working with hemophilia and HIV and so on. And I think that, informed consent is extremely important, and knowing your body and knowing your rights is very important. So I'd like to thank you for sharing these stories, as horrible and as horrifying as they are.
I'm so glad there were so many. I'm so glad you brought your class, and I'm so glad there were so many biologists here and people that are going into the medical field.
It is eye-opening, and it's important for my students to see as well, because a lot of these are biotech students. They may be going into pharmaceuticals. They may be going into other things.
Right.
And instead of just doing what you're told, you should kind of really be knowing what you're doing.
And there are still experiments that are being done, have been done, and will be done that are totally ethical. I'm not saying that every experiment is what you just saw there. A lot of them are, but the ones that you get into don't have to be done that way. It's your choice. What company you want to work for, or maybe trying to change the policies of that particular company that you work for. Does it have to be done this way? Or telling the subjects, telling the human beings, treating them like human beings. Yes, please.
I wonder if you could speak to sort of the eugenics angle here, with forced sterilizations and also in Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, she wasn't fully informed about her cancer treatment and that it was going to make her infertile.
Right.
So to me, that's another form of eugenics there, trying to control the
Absolutely.
The population in that way.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I mean, it's so heavy in the history of experimentation and involuntary procedures. More so than maybe some of the other reasons. Is this either very intentional or kind of covert eugenics ideology where we want to try and eliminate the unwanted, the inferior, the bad, the poor, the criminals, the people of color, and how do we promote the breeding of the superior? And Nazi Germany was kind of the most blatant movement that did this, but that has happened here in the United States. And again, with what they did with poor women, Hispanic women, black women, the Puerto Ricans, Guatemalans, you know, it's not a coincidence that they're going overseas and working on populations of people of color, either overseas or in this country. That is absolutely a form of eugenics ideology. They're not going to Beverly Hills. They're not going to all white areas. They're not going to the wives or the daughters of Supreme Court justices or of congresspeople. They're going to certain specific groups of people that they deem, and it all gets back to who's worthy of life, who's worthy of human rights, who's worthy of civil rights. And don't forget, you know, up until the mid-60s, people of color had very few civil rights, and not just down south, but all throughout America. We still had anti-miscegenation laws. People couldn't marry each other if they were, you know, of different color. You know, there were a lot of civil rights abuses in this country. We're still fighting for total civil rights, yes.
Sorry, I missed half the presentation
please.
because of my schedule, but even the part that I saw, what is shocking to me that it's happening now in 2012 and 2013. So these are not, just to put things in perspective, and this was eye-opening for me for the presentation that I saw, that we're not talking about we're not talking just about history, we're talking about the present.
Right.
And what we should keep in mind is that we're part of this. This is happening to us, and you should think, and people should not be afraid to say no and ask questions when you go
Right.
to get an exam or when you have your blood drawn.
Right.
And you have the right to say no, and you have the right to ask questions, and you have the right to know exactly what is happening to your cells. And as Dr. Novick pointed out, is that I agree that if Henrietta Lacks was asked, they would probably say yes. And I think if most people were asked, they would say yes, as long as people know what's going on. And the fact that there are toxins being released in the subway system and we don't know about this, how can this be happening? Why do we allow this to happen? And we live here. This is New York City. There are millions of people who ride the subway on a daily basis. It's so easy for people to do this. And we should make it clear that we know about it, that we want to know about it, and if we don't like it, it should not be happening. So it becomes, now this addresses a socio-political aspect to this whole issue. We are not just scientists, we're just not students or professors, we're citizens. And we elect politicians, and you should go out and vote, and you should tell your politicians that you vote what you want, and if they don't do it, do not vote them. Okay? And this is our money that is being used to do all this stuff. So we have to, and I admit that I'm partly guilty about this too, that being passive makes you guilty. I mean, that's what it boils down to, and we're suffering the consequences, and I'm really glad that you gave us even the latest incidents that are happening, so thank you for that. So these are things that we should all be thinking about, and especially you, the 20-year-olds, you're the next generation. You're going to produce the next generation, so we need you to be healthy and not get exposed to toxins and warfare agents. We have students working in labs, and we try to protect them, and this is like a minute scale of what's happening out there. In the lab, it's a controlled environment, more or less. When you're walking on the street,
right,
forget about it.
Right. And you brought up such an excellent point about we all go to doctors. At some time, we all go to a doctor, whether it's a routine thing or because we're sick. And as you mentioned, we have to protect ourselves. You owe it to yourself. Ask them a lot of questions. If they get upset with you and they don't like it, go to a different doctor. You know, it used to mean the mentality of patients, of patients has changed over the years because, you know, it was a time in like up until maybe the 60s, the 70s where doctors were God. You never questioned them. You didn't even think to ask them a question or to get maybe even a second opinion. And now you have to. And you have a right to say who is going to be, after you test my blood to see if I have, you know, a strep infection or whatever it is, a swab, is anything going to happen to it? Is it going anywhere else for testing? What's going to happen to it? They may not know. They may be shocked, but we have to do that to help ourselves in whatever little increments we can. That will help change policy. Yes, please.
After looking at your slide, I thank you so much for bringing it up. I discovered that like most of the really brutal experiments was in the 1950s, and back then I could say that probably humans don't know the meaning of the word humane, to be able to like dissect people without anesthesia.
Yeah.
But like stretching those kind of experiments back to the 2000s is what I consider is unacceptable. So the pharmaceutical companies might have like so much money, they can't. Writing a letter to them wouldn't let them leave the trillions of dollars just spending outside of the United States just to come to the city. So I just wanted to know if the Congress is like putting much any effort to like restrict their experiments, and is there any movement to like educate any other countries, like in China, about limiting the experiment they're doing on humans?
I think Japan recently acknowledged what they did in Manchuria at Unit 731 and at other places. There haven't been any reparations made. For our own country, we saw those results with the Guatemalans, that even when it reaches that stage of being in a court, it gets dismissed. And yeah, with the pharmaceutical companies, writing a letter to them probably won't do any good, but we can put pressure on our legislators. If we put enough pressure on enough legislators, Congress has to deal with it. If we don't care, if we don't think, oh, it's just, you know, my email, my letter, my phone call, then it's never going to change. But if it becomes enough of an issue, like health care, like gay marriage rights, if enough people are interested in changing something, they'll put pressure on legislators, and that's when things will change. It used to be that if this gentleman here and I wanted to get married, we couldn't. It was illegal. It was only through a Supreme Court case where it was overturned and changed. Certain things will change if the legislators, if the court cases, we need to put pressure on as voters, as residents, as citizens. We need to put pressure on the people that do have the power. But it has to be all of us. It can't just be a few of us.
Everything you say is correct and all, but I feel that that it all goes back to one point, which is racism. That even though we wouldn't like our country, you know, we've been trying to get over racism for quite a while, but it keeps coming back. That why is it the subway system that's being attacked with these toxins? You know, if we actually pull like a random subway station, how many people are their ancestors actually American? And you know, we're not going to really find that much. Even in this own room, I'm pretty sure that if we ask whose ancestors are not American, 99% of us would raise our hands. And I mean, I guess it all comes, like what you were saying before, that all white neighborhoods aren't being targeted as well. So I guess that's just one problem that it keeps coming back to us.
Racism and classism, you know, persecution of poor people. You know, again, this isn't happening in Beverly Hills. They're not spraying Beverly Hills. They're spraying the subway system. They're doing experiments on poor sharecroppers in Alabama, in Guatemala, in Puerto Rico, on mentally disabled children here. You know, they're very smart. You know, these corporations, the pharmaceutical companies, our government, our army, they're not stupid in who they're picking to experiment upon like this. And racism, you know, it's never gone away. It's you know, it's still front and center even today. It's much better than it used to be, but, you know, in the sexism, the misogyny, it's not a coincidence that, you know, if we're talking about sterilization and birth control, most of the experiments, the majority, not all of them, because we saw the testicular experiments and the sterilization that was conducting in Indiana in the early 1900s and late 1800s, most of them, though, are against women, are on women. When you look at birth control, other than condoms, it's all the woman's body, the woman's responsibility. The birth control pill industry, everything is geared, you know, for women. And all those experiments have been done on women because, you know, men, when you even say the word vasectomy, sometimes men will run out of the room. Congress doesn't really want to speak about it. They are, you know, a more privileged group in some sense. Well, I really thank you for your time, and I thank you for your future good, moral, ethical choices in whatever field you go into. And have a really good day. Oh, a homework assignment for all of you, including the professors. And it's a similar homework assignment that I give when I give tours over at my Holocaust Center. Because you have sat here for a really long time and listened to some of the most horrible stuff you can ever imagine, and it's still happening to us today, your homework assignment is that you need to do something fun, joyful, later on at some point, either today or tonight. You need to kind of balance out what this afternoon was.
I ask that you remain seated for just one moment.